When we built at Kemet, we were a stable society. When we built Nubia, we were a stable society. Meru, Napata. When we developed those things, they call now the Rosetta Stone, the Meru script, the hieroglyphics, the demotic, the hieratic scripts, the Ishango bone. Our oldest evidence of mathematical knowledge is Ishango bone, which is like 12,000 years ago, But then you have even the Ashanti bones, you have other bones that are even older than that, 45,000 years going back, evidence of mathematics and evidence of advanced civilization. So it is, when we are stable, we build a civilization. And when we were running around, mfekani, difakani, chasing one another around, or migrations, or running away from the slave masters and so forth, it is a survival culture where we just kill the cow, take the skin, wear it and go. We did not develop industry. But when we were stable and flourishing communities, we developed industry. Now we can't use survival culture or remnants of survival culture or things that came out of survival culture as a reflection of an African culture. We had our own universities in this continent, Sankore, Timbuktu, Kemet, Laksa, and all of those places.
Then why people
it almost looks like when religion
such?
walks up to you,
Blinds you.
it must numb your brain from common sense, so that a simple question like how many days are between Friday and Sunday, you begin to want to chew your thing. It's like almost all the knowledge you went to school for disappears through the window.
But maybe Christianity pushes faith more than rationale. So if you're accepted by faith, maybe you don't have to reason.
But faith
Does faith kill reasoning? Is Christianity responsible in derailing the progress and civilization of Africa? Do what we have today as Christianity, or what we see as Christianity, a fragment of what we actually believe to be hallucination of mysticism, something that cannot be objective? The reason, the faith without logic, is it what we sing today that the advancement of the modern science owes itself to Christianity? Let me explain. I said to you, I'm not going to talk belief, but I'm going to talk research. You can go research it. It's the Needham's paradox or the Needham's question for you to come to your own conclusion. Now, Needham actually studied out in China, the civilization, and said it was more advanced than all the other, nations on earth in China, before even Africa was advanced. However, Europe, yes, was later than even Africa, because Europe would be advanced at about the Renaissance, which was about 16 to 1700s, when Africa was more advanced way earlier. So that is where my basis is. But Europe was able to catch Africa, to catch up with China, and even overtake, because of what? Christianity. Let me show you how. The Needham's theory says China couldn't develop the modern science we have today, Africa itself. So if you look into China and Africa, you realize the approach of science they had was more similar. One, it was in astronomy, mathematics, algebra. It was also based on medicine as well. It was seemingly the same path that Africa was taking with China. Not only Africa, but the Mayan Empire, as well as the Incan Empire, which is in America. So they were all taking this same route. So if you look into the commonality between these places, China, Africa, as well as these empires, Incan and Mayan, you realize they all had this basic type of science, a practical science or practical application of science. They all had this thing. Now, what came out of Europe, which is what came through Christianity, I'm going to show you a little bit of history from that. Please do your own study. Don't just come to a specific conclusion because I believe that any scholastic research should be objective, not subjective or biased. So when you look into Europe, you realize this came from Christianity, because this type of advanced science we have today, the modern science we have today, it comes from abstract theorizing, which is mathematization of hypothesis. This is something that was not there in China. This is something that was not there in Africa. This is something that was not there in Incan or the Mayan empires. It only came from Europe. Let me show you a good example. So then, with Europe was not advanced. It caught up later with all these civilizations that I just told you about. It was in the 1600s where we see now the coming up of Galileo, we see the coming up of Isaac Newton, we see the coming up of Kepler, we see the coming up. Firstly, Isaac Newton were more influenced by such men as Michael Faraday. Michael Faraday was a self-taught guy. He wasn't even a scientist many people would recommend, but he studied a lot of science texts and all of that. So he's the first person that brought out electromagnetism. This is where now you see the laws that would govern electricity, engineering, about calculus. We're coming to Isaac Newton. We're talking about such things as the laws of motion, whether engineering of light. We're talking about Isaac Newton. So the type of engineering or science we have today, all this background to Christianity. How am I saying Christianity? The Needham's theory or paradox says China could not have caught up to this modern civilization or modern science because of the reason being is that China had what you call Confucianism as well as Taoism. It also had Buddhism. Now, the thing with Europe is that it had a unification principle. Unification principle, it was that Europe prior to this civilization, it believed that a universe is created by a single God who had actually put out a code in all these natural things that need to be studied. So China, on the other hand, Confucianism, Buddhism, as well as Taoism, they believed in actually the stabilization or harmony with nature. So it didn't believe in such things such as reductionist science. Reductionist science is going around and saying, let's cut trees and study them, because for it, when it comes to China, harmonization with nature, it would believe, no, this would be against this thing of believing nature on its own, it's God. So if you do reductionist science, therefore now you are actually cutting out some of the aspects of the divinity or the God nature, the God aspects in nature. So in simple terms, I am saying that in your life, you are only limited by your belief system. So Africa could never have stepped up to this, because with China, it believed in a different polytheistic gods, a different numerous type of gods like China, instead of believing in unification, a single God who has actually embedded everything of his DNA in every aspect of nature. Now, let's go on with what Needham also says. Now, other people will say, but what about Islam? Because Islam also had a golden age. Yes, Islam had a golden age with as well as its advanced mathematics, as well as its advanced astronomy, because of its trade routes and stuff. However, it was also the practical application of knowledge, not really abstract theorizing as the one that came out of Western Europe. That the foundation of the modern civilization we have, or science, it was because of it was actually speared by what would be known as the logic. When Christianity began to say, can actually faith have logic? This was around the 1270s. We have such scholars like Thomas Aquinas. You can go study him. These guys actually said, can we argue that God's existence can be seen apart from using the Bible or theology, but just looking at nature? So this is where we have the schools coming out, such as called the cosmological arguments. So they use the Aristotelian logic to arrive to this conclusion of say, can we prove the existence of God just by using logic? And this then began a revival in Europe to what would be known today as a Renaissance. In Renaissance then, in China you would go and have paintings that seem to actually affect what we'd call expressionism. The same thing that you see globally in the world today, expressionism. But the Renaissance in Western Europe, because of Christianity, it actually began now to create universities that seemed to study. They said, in nature we can see the divine code of God. By this now, they said they came out with what is called the empiricism. When speaking about empiricism, there's two theories of conclusion when it comes to philosophy. One says rationalism, which is actually the one where you're speaking about ideas, thoughts, and concepts, and another one is empiricism, which is speaking about everything that has to do outside of the five senses, or can be deducted or concluded by the five senses. So this type of logical scientific research would come out of Europe, not out of China, not out of Africa. In the Renaissance, the type of arts that were produced were the arts that seemed to focus on geometry, not the geometry that you see in Egypt, which is applicable, which is by practice and application, but instead it was abstract theorizing, where we see the mathematization of hypotheses that began to come out. So now Christianity was more involved in this, because why? When you look at Isaac Newton, approach they have, their belief system opened them up to say, we can actually see the elements of God embedded in light. We can see the elements of God embedded in the forces of nature. This was the foundation of what Thomas Aquinas, the theologians, were actually bringing out in Europe and the school of thought to say to them, guys, do you know that we can come to a conclusion by understanding more of what God is doing through actually knowing that nature is governed by specific principles and laws. What became later as natural science to say that nature actually has laws that govern it, where Isaac Newton came out about. So this was true to Christianity, where we came to such conclusions. Therefore, Europe was actually able now to surpass all these civilizations. What Thau is saying to say, when we are stable, we build civilizations. This is actually not true. Because when we find, according to philosophy, according to science, according to theology, in any aspect, we find that the civilizations that have come out to be great in whatever way they came to be great, it was because of competition, it was because of instability. For a good example, we know that China became what it is today is because of, we know that the Mongolian empires and all of that, how Genghis Khan wanted to rule and conquer the world. And we also know that this is the same thing that happened to Europe, and how it came about. It was because of competition within its own civilization. Now, Africa on its own, it actually had an opportunity because the government of Africa was decentralized. However, the ideas and the religion and spirituality was centralized, though it had different types of gods. So it was limited by this. So with Europe, then we see it coming forth because it had competition. Thau is saying to say we had the universities of Timbuktu as well as the Sankore, Al-Azhar, the Al-Azhar universities or school of thoughts. Let me be honest with you. Africa really did have schools of thought or even teachings that actually came ancient of years ago. Good example in Egypt is that priests used to teach their students. So in schools, the priests used to teach knowledge, but it was also a practical knowledge. That's not the abstract knowledge we have today. Timbuktu University, Sankore, I can actually debunk that because these universities that came out of Africa, Timbuktu, Sankore, Al-Azhar, these universities were actually Muslim. They were built by Muslims, Islam. They focused more also in the Sharia law. In anything that was studied or science that was studied, it had to be actually based on the theology of Islam. Though there were aspects of Africanism or school of thought, which is the oral teachings, as well as the languages of Africa that were taught there. So we have to actually acclaim to that to say there were aspects of Africanism, though it was used to actually stabilize a community or the nation in terms of Islam. There was schools of thought in Africa, though in the terms of their philosophical approach, scientific or technological approach, they were more into practical application, not into abstract theorizing like those that came out of Europe. Kepler, Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, Ambrose, all these guys had one common thing in them, that they were Christians. The guys who brought us the modern science, electromagnetism, study of gravity, study of flights, the study of motion, movement, forces of nature. What are we talking about? So the modern science, all of it was built upon these foundations. Had this foundation not be there, modern science would not exist. So